started. I'm going to tell you about our speakers, and then we'll just get right into it. We're here partly today to discuss this new book by Pratap Chatterjee. It's called Halliburton's Army: How a Well-Connected Texas Oil Company Revolutionized the Way America Makes War. And it's from Nation Books. And Pratap's the managing editor and founder of CorpWatch, which is one of the most effective investigative watchdog groups in America. In addition to the book I mentioned, he's the author of Iraq, Inc. Our second speaker will be Michael A. Cohen. He's a senior research fellow here in America. And he's the co-author of a very useful report, Changing the Culture of Pentagon Contracting. He's also a political pundit, and his most recent book, Live from the Campaign Trail, The Greatest Presidential Campaign Speeches of the 20th Century, How They Shaped Modern America. And I get a kickback from the authors for doing the subtitle, as well as the title of their books. And then we'll hear from Janine Wedel, who's a fellow here at New America, professor at George Mason University, author of a forthcoming book that I, for one, am very much looking forward to, called Shadow Elite, The New Agents of Power and Influence. And I'd be somewhat less than forthcoming if I didn't mention it. I also have a book coming out sometime in the next 4 years, which is a history of the Lockheed Martin Corporation and their role in making of the modern military-industrial complex. So we'll hear from Pratap first, and then we'll move it along. I feel confident we'll have time for a good discussion.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out. And thanks especially to New America Foundation for hosting me here on their very first event in this facility. So I'm truly honored, and really honored to be with all of you presenting. I wanted to start out actually by telling you what this discussion will not be about, because when I talk about KBR or Halliburton, most people say to me, did Cheney give them the contract? Did he make trillions off the contract? What about the electrocutions and the rape? Can Obama cancel the contract? And will Obama cancel the contract? We can discuss those issues, but I actually think we have to talk about, and this is really the subject of this panel, is really about Pentagon acquisitions. And so the very brief answers to those first questions is, did Cheney give them the contract? We have no evidence. I don't think he did, and I don't think it's relevant, and we'll get to that point. Did he make trillions out of the contract, which is a question that I'm asked surprisingly pretty often. I don't think he even really made millions. He made as much as a CEO would. What about the electrocutions and the rape and that sort of thing? And again, I think these are symptoms that we'll again discuss briefly, but we have to look at a very much bigger picture. Can Obama cancel the contract? Not in the short term, he can't. And will he cancel it? I don't think so. So, having said that, and probably annoyed everybody on the left, I want to explain a little bit about KBR and why we have Halliburton's army. Napoleon once said that an army marches on its stomach, and it's important to understand today that if that's true, and I really honestly believe that to be true, that stomach is fed by KBR, by a 100 battalion strong group of workers, some 50,000 people, who supply the food, build the bases, clean the toilets, and do all the mundane aspects of military logistics. And the question you might ask is, why, a little like, why did Cheney give the contract? Why is it that military logistics have been handed over to a private company? And actually, if you could push the buttons in the point. So we'll actually show you a few slides as I talk, just to illustrate this a little bit. I can't see, so I have to keep looking back. But I mean, you're all familiar with this poster of army recruitment, and we'll just go to the second one, which is one that I took in Iraq about a year ago. And I don't know if you can see. Can people read it, or is it hard to read? It's actually a poster from the First World War, General Pershing recruiting people into the quartermaster battalion, saying, you can earn $100 a month for a quartermaster. Your government furnishes everything. The idea being is to try and exhort people to join the military. If you go now to the next PowerPoint, we see a draft card actually from the First World War. And the reality has always been, since the draft was first attempted to be put into practice by the Confederated States of America in 1862, they've had to try and recruit people to join this military to go to war. We'll go to the next one, which is one that you're probably familiar with, which is the people burning draft cards. And as recently as 1863, I mean, as long back as 1863, people were violently protesting against the draft. And of course, this is from the Vietnam era in the 1960s. And hence, because it's become very hard to get people to join a draft army, and this is really kind of the subject of this book, is the transformation of a draft army into a volunteer army. And hence it behooves the military to be able to supply those troops with all the material and all the services that they once had to do in the draft, which was, peeling potatoes, cleaning toilets, and that sort of thing. So if we can have the next slide. This is actually from Camp Anaconda. Is it hard to see because of the lights? I mean, you can see things? Okay. So this is actually one of the few pictures I actually found which actually had a Halliburton logo in it. And part of the reason is Halliburton itself is not really engaged in Iraq, and they'll tell you they've never been in Iraq. The reason is it's really a former subsidiary of theirs called Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR. And so you see KBR logos everywhere. It's very rare to find a picture that actually says Halliburton, but I thought it sort of illustrated the company at the heart of this debate. If we go on to the next slide. So you remember the slide I showed you of recruitment into quartermaster battalions in the First World War, where they were offering people, $100 a month. Today, really, the people they're recruiting, the bulk of Halliburton's army is actually Third World workers. They're people from India, Sri Lanka, Fiji, places like that. And so this is actually a recruitment post in Kuwait that I took probably a couple of years ago. The salary offered is 325 KD for somebody working in laundry, which translates at the current exchange rates of about $1,000 a month. And that's not entirely accurate. You typically will get for that kind of a job, for the lowest level jobs in Iraq, something more like $300 a month. And in fact, if you're doing that same job in Kuwait, you might be getting as little as $100 a month. Let's go to the next one. So the jobs that KBR, or Halliburton, if you want to call it Halliburton, does are the jobs that are dirty and dull that soldiers didn't really want to do. So it involves cleaning toilets, and you'll notice that the toilets actually mark KBR and they're numbered. This is from Camp Anaconda. Let's go to the next one. This is a trash dumpster, once again labeled KBR, and then the next one. The laundry, so the laundry that they were advertising for people to come to. Let's go to the next one. And these are some of the workers, and as I said, most of them are South Asian or Southeast Asian. They're Indian, they're Filipino, and here they are sort of serving food to troops, once again in Camp Anaconda. Camp Anaconda, for those of you that don't know, is just outside an Iraqi town named Balad, and it is the central logistical base for all of Iraq. So most things are managed out of there.
No local in Iraq doing it?
No. So this is actually quite important. These are not Iraqis. These are Indians who do this work. So most workers on an American base in Iraq will be South Asian or Southeast Asian or from former Yugoslavia. They are not Iraqi. And that's actually quite a contrast with other bases. So if you went to a base like Camp Barnsteel in Kosovo, you'll find most of the workers are Serbian or Kosovar. But in Iraq, it is mostly what are called third country nationals.
What is different?
The difference is partly because I think the military is afraid of using local workers in case of infiltration. It's primarily that. Just to explain that, this is actually quite normal in the region. So if you go to Kuwait or you go to Dubai, for example, is 85% foreign workers, from people at the very bottom, the Bangladeshis that do manual labor, to the people at the very top, let's say Americans or British citizens who are paid very high salaries to work in Dubai. So Iraq itself, for example, when Iraqi men went to the front in the Iran-Iraq war, used migrant labor from Egypt. So it is pretty common in the oil-rich Gulf states to use migrant labor. And so the US, in using this, is not actually doing that much different from any local country. Let's move forward a little bit. So now, if you looked at a menu from the Second World War, you would see people having powdered eggs and powdered milk and powdered coffee. And if you went to the Persian Gulf War in 1991, you would see people having MREs and short rations and that sort of thing. The menu today has changed. And so the menu, again, if you can read it, this is a random day that I was in Iraq last year, where you actually have a menu with roast turkey, prime rib, seasoned mixed vegetables, and you have a dessert bar where you would have pumpkin pie and you would have apple pie. Now I want to stress that these are the big bases. This is not true in small combat outposts, but by and large, most American troops in Iraq serve on big bases. So 100,000 of the 160,000 soldiers that are in Iraq today are serving on inside big bases. They're not out there in combat. In fact, they will probably very rarely meet an Iraqi at all. Let's go on to the next one. Just again, the kind of menus. This is now once again, once you bring in migrant labor to do the work, and they have, let's say, more experience than an 18-year-old who might have been pressed into cleaning potatoes and cooking up an army menu, is you can actually offer different menus every day. So on Mondays you have an Indian night, and we'll go to the next one. In Easter you can have chocolate-covered bunnies. You can have a roasted turkey. Let's go to the next one. So this is actually I think this may have been Thanksgiving. That's a cake down there that was baked by KBR chefs. Now, it is actually very important to understand why this is taking place. And it is really because of the absence of a draft. In today's 21st century, if you want to attract a volunteer army, you're going to have to provide the kind of amenities that an American teenager would like to see. And that includes McDonald's or Burger King, Walmart's, Xboxes. Let's go through fairly quickly. There's not a lot more slides. This is actually Dick Cheney at that very same facility having breakfast with the troops. Well, I think that's you must have forgotten his KBR badge. Let's say it's Logistical Supply Anaconda. So that is the big military base. It is the main logistical headquarters. Let's go on to the next one. KBR workers can also provide a variety of amenities. That's a swimming pool run by KBR. Let's move on to the next one. Again, swimming pool. This is a group of soldiers that had just done guard duty in a convoy, and they'd come and they were able to spend time at the Anaconda swimming pool. We'll move on to the next one. You can organize facilities. I mean, rather like the USA used to do, USO, sorry. Salsa nights, swing dance nights, country music. Let's move on. Movies. Next one. This is the military end of it. So if you go to the dining facility on a U.S. military base, this is an average dining facility I'm taking. There are a little over 200 workers there. There are about 25 soldiers whose most important job is to monitor the contract by KBR/Halliburton. And there are about 8 Halliburton /KBR supervisors who are directly employed in Houston by the company in Houston, but 175 workers who are South Asian or Southeast Asian. So they're from India, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, what have you. So the U.S. military now is entirely dependent on this army of third country nationals and American supervisors to do its work. These are the guys in what's called, so we'll just go back for a second. So these are the guys running what's called the fusion cell. And the fusion cell is actually where the military manages logistics, munitions, and transportation. So they're actually contractors. They're not in the room right now because the room had to be sanitized before I walked in. And so contractors were taken out every move from NIPRNet to SIPRNet, from the secret network, computer network, to the unclassified network. So this guy actually worked at the State Department, and his job was disaster response. And so he, as a reservist, had come in, was managing, at the military level, logistics. He's sort of top level of what would have been a quartermaster battalion, to really simplify things a little bit. Switch to the next slide. And this is actually the KBR facility, the KBR hotel at which a lot of the workers, the supervisors stay. So this is the Khalifa in Kuwait, where Halliburton supervisors are staying. It's a very nice facility, and a lot of the KBR supervisors at the top end will be earning actually pretty high salaries. We're going to now attempt some video, and this is the second last thing, I think. So press the next thing, and it should actually start playing.
This Wolf, this is an appalling story, and it's unfolding still, even as I stand here in the middle of the Iraqi night. What we have is about 1,000 Asian contract labourers who are being all but confined here in the midst of a war zone by a Kuwaiti company subcontracted to the American KBR conglomerate. Here's their story.
They say they feel like prisoners, locked in a derelict warehouse for months on end. No salaries, poor food, and armed security guards prowling the fences. It's an obscenity. Abuse of contract workers in Iraq. From India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Uganda, more than 1,000 men are penned here, lured to Baghdad with promises of jobs that did not exist. Even crueler, most paid for the privilege to come, selling farms or anything of value, told they had jobs waiting with American giant KBR. All through Nujula Catering Services, a Kuwaiti company, whose officials in Iraq refused to comment. Their Kuwaiti office saying only that the situation was under control and being dealt with. KBR says it abhors unethical behaviour, insisting its contractors abide by its code of conduct, and it alerts authorities when contractors do not. But the Kuwaiti company who received these men from the recruiters shoved them in here. A compound within Baghdad's airport, with showers without water and taps that are useless. 600 men who'd hoped to send money to their families piled in one room, as many as 4 to a bed, and apparently all forgotten. A nuisance no one wanted to address. Unable to stay without visas, they're unable to go without money.
We'll just pause
And
it
when
there.
they protested, the guards fired above to silence them. These Ugandans say Iraqi police handcuffed and beat them, but the police
Sorry, we could continue with the video. I want to point out that I don't want to suggest that this is the working conditions of all Indian workers there. And so you have to take what the media tells you sometimes with a bit of a grain of salt. This is actually, I think, filmed in December of 2008. It's not necessarily the working conditions of everybody there. In this particular case, what happened was the subcontractor brought the workers to Iraq and then lost their contract, and so they didn't know what to do with the workers, so they just stuck them in a warehouse and left them to fend for themselves. So eventually, the people, went on strike and started complaining. There was a story, I think, in McClatchy, and CNN picked up this video. So that's quite dramatic. And again, since I've been on these bases a number of times and talked to a lot of people, I do want to point out that a lot of people are also recruited knowing full well that they're going to get there, and they know what kind of conditions they'll be living in, and they're not necessarily all up in arms. They're resigned to the fact that this is the best way, as many Indians have done over the last 5 decades, brought money home from Kuwait. One of the things that I want to really put this in the context of is, I could talk to you more about, as I mentioned earlier, the electrocutions, the rapes, and all these other little symptoms. I think what these tales actually miss is the evolution of Pentagon contracting over the last 40 years, from using construction crews to build bases in Vietnam. And just to flip back a little bit, KBR's didn't get its first contract in Iraq. In fact, its first contracts date back to 1966, and even before that. But when Don Rumsfeld actually went to Vietnam to look at Brown and Root contracting there and came back to complain about Lyndon B. Johnson. Oops, I think that's my where was that? Back in those days, Brown and Root, which for those of you that remember the Vietnam was called Burn and Loot by anti-war protesters, was building bases. And Rumsfeld went there to come and talk about the fact that the company was missing receipts, it was overcharging, and it was paying off, the president at the time, meaning Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat. So what happened between then and now? And what is different between then and now? And again, as I said before, it is the transition from a draft army, where you had construction crews building bases, today to a volunteer army, where you have Indians actually serving food, cleaning toilets, and doing everything that a draft army was once asked to do. So the military often talks about what's called a revolution in military affairs, and typically people are discussing the technological revolution, the use of satellite-guided missiles. They're talking about night vision goggles and that sort of thing. It is very important to mention, as I just explained, is this has been accompanied by a logistical revolution, containerized shipping, the use of modern management techniques, and the ability to be able to serve troops in the field without them even really having to worry about what's happening next. Particularly this contract, which KBR operates under, which is called the Logistical Civilian Augmentation Program, is a tool by which the military can actually set up bases in advance of a war, in the case of the invasion of Iraq. So there were people in the desert in Kuwait setting up as early as January 2002 and building bases as early as September of 2002. So by the time the invasion happened in March of 2003, everything was pretty much in place. And what it is, of course, accompanying this logistical revolution is a sociological revolution in the way Americans expect to go to war. So if you're going to recruit a soldier, you're going to have to provide him with the amenities that KBR provides. And it is just as important to understand that this didn't suddenly jump from Rumsfeld, from LBJ to Bush, but in fact, in between, and this is, there was a sea change in how procurement was done. And this is where we get into the business of acquisition. The first contract, major contract in which KBR, or Brown and Root at the time, was doing cooking and cleaning and that sort of thing was really in Bosnia. And the time that happened, that contract was instituted, is actually important. It was July 2005, before Cheney became CEO of Halliburton. So a lot of people will say, well, Cheney is the one who created these contracts.
2005, so 95.
I mean 1995. Thank you, Bill. So in 1995. So the important thing is the Pentagon has gone through an evolution, how it does contracting, and because I only have about 4 minutes left, I won't explain how that happened. But let's suffice it to say that there was a sea change in the Clinton-Gore administration. You remember reinventing government, in which procurement, and in fact there's somebody in this audience who knows a lot more about this than I do, how these procurement rules would change. So a system of bringing in private contractors to do anything that is considered not inherently governmental, was set up in those days before Cheney even became CEO of Halliburton. And I won't get into the subject of inherently governmental because Michael will actually take that up, and because that is actually very relevant in talking about today, which is what he will address. But what's most important to understand is that KBR is not actually a contractor employing Indian workers. It has replaced the military contracting system itself, where the military has 10,000 contracting offices in the United States today to handle $400 billion in contracts. The $5 billion, it's more like $20 billion a year that is actually put out in Iraq is managed by perhaps 75 contracting offices. So KBR's role is to manage those contracts. And it has somebody above it right now under the new law, Cap 4, which is a company called Serco. And Serco's job is not actually to audit KBR, but its job is to check its estimates and see if the estimates are valid. So one of the changes in kicking KBR out of Iraq, which happened a couple of years ago, was to bring in a new management system over KBR. And I'm sort of running really quick over this so we can get through it. The second important thing is when you understand that KBR is actually managing the acquisition process itself, is the role of the Defense Contract Audit Agency. And in my book, I sing the praise of the Defense Contract Audit Agency, and Henry Waxman, if you've seen any of the the hearings he's held will talk about all this data he's got from the DCAA. But I want to actually point out here today that the DCAA actually is a fundamentally broken system. And here's the second problem, apart from the fact that KBR now actually handles most of the actual subcontracting itself, is you have auditors who run what's called a metric system. And this is an evolution of the last 20 years, starting with a guy by the name of Bill Reed and perfected under the current head of the DCAA, whose name is April Stevenson, where auditors are basically judging how fast they finish an audit. And so instead of seeing the problems that exist on the ground in Iraq, they're basically trying to churn out as many audits as they can. And I'll give you one single example, which is that DCAA was supposed to look at a audit that would have, of TRW, a big military contractor, which would have taken 21 audit years normally to finish. And they finished it, I think, in 6 audit years. So they compressed 21, it doesn't mean 21 years, it means 21 people working for a year or whatever, and they compressed into 6 years. So they got an award from DCAA for having done this contract very, very quickly. However, 6 years later, a whistleblower from the company, I think perhaps even some of the CFO, came forward to say under QTAM suit, the company had defrauded the government to the tune of $111 million. So we have a broken acquisition system, we have a broken auditing system, and we have a military, or rather perhaps a military, but more so an administration, in the case of the Bush administration, and even now under the Obama administration, that wants to be able to support troops in the field as best they can, and use the system of contractors to fight ideological battles, whether it is Bush in invading Iraq or Obama in, let's say, propping up the system in Afghanistan. Where in fact I think now the number of contractors in Afghanistan is double the number of troops in the field. And that's not a perfect number because a lot of that is people working on reconstruction. It's not people working on supporting the troops directly. I will stop there because I want to give enough time for Michael to actually pick up on this, and Janine, and we can all take questions on the specifics of any particular thing, whether it's electrocutions or the role of Cheney and how much he made.
So Michael.
Thank you for a very insightful introduction. Sorry, I left my visual aids at home, actually. And Bill, thank you for that introduction as well. And I just want to say, Pratap has written a really, I think, important book here. I think it helps us better understand the implication of the DoD's reliance on contractors. And he brings to light sort of the dirty little secret that those in the military, those in the contracting world, and those of us on this panel foolish enough to spend our time researching this issue understand all too well, which is that our military cannot fulfill its missions without private contractors. And I think I probably have a little different view on this than Pratap, maybe, or others, that I'm not convinced this is necessarily a bad thing. I think contractors can fill certain needs the military cannot or should not be doing, and that they bring real cost benefits to the table. But contracting only works under certain circumstances. It works if you have A, proper accountability and oversight mechanisms in place, and B, you thought through the logistical, the legal, and manpower-related issues around the issues of private contractors. And over the past 6 years, the Pentagon, State Department, and Congress has simply failed in this task. And this is a problem that's not going away. Our reliance on contractors is only going to be increasing. And I'm sort of sorry to say a little bit that what I'm hearing from the Obama administration so far is a lot of talk on the issue, but not clear sense that they're confronting the issue properly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. To the first point, I think there's been a real, as I said, abdication of responsibility by policymakers in both branches of the government on this issue. I mean, imagine this: 6 years since we invaded Iraq, we still do not have a clear legal framework for prosecuting or holding accountable private security contractors who work for the State Department. Okay, that right now those are Blackwater contractor, Z contractors, whatever you want to call that. Student will be dying quadruple canopy. We have a legal framework for PSCs who work for the military but not for the State Department, and we've seen legislation on the Hill to expand the MIJA, Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Authority, to state contractors. Has not happened. So to this day, if an incident were to happen tomorrow, there would still be really fuzzy legal issues over accountability for these contractors. From a management standpoint, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, has said repeatedly that the Pentagon has failed to assess and track its use of contractors. And this is a problem that's been going on now for several years. And I would even go further than what the GAO has said. What they really failed to do is integrate contractors into the total force. And they failed to think systematically about the role contractors play in U.S. national security operations. One of the points I saw recently in testimony on the Hill from the head of the GAO was thousands of people made the decision to send contractors to Iraq. Thousands of small decisions were made. But there's no one person at the Pentagon and no one person in the Bush administration who made the decision to send contractors to Iraq. And this is at a time when we have literally more contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan than we have actual uniformed military. So the key, my mind's more effectively integrating contractors into the U.S. military is it must begin with a real cultural shift. Civilian and military leadership must accept the inevitability of using contractors and the necessity of integrating them into both determinations of force structure, but also fulfillment of mission requirements. Now, much of the problem, quite frankly, has come from the Bush administration, which simply did not take seriously the implications of its growing reliance on contractors. And that inaction was matched by similar inaction on Capitol Hill, which did a really poor job of oversight of this issue. And while pleased to see the Obama administration devoting more energy to the issue, the results are not, I think, what they need to be. Last week, I'm sure many of you probably saw President Obama unveil a presidential memorandum on contracting. And instead of dealing decisively with the issue, I think it kind of kicks it down the road a little bit. The first issue is on inherently governmental, and I won't bore all of you with what exactly inherently governmental means, because part of the problem is that no one actually is really sure what it means. It's one of those expressions that reminds me of that old Potter Stewart quote about obscenity, and I know when I see it. The problem is that everyone has a different definition of obscenity, and everyone has a different definition of inherently governmental. If you look at the U.S. Code, for example, uses the term 15 different times. The DoD uses more than 120 pages to describe inherently governmental activities. The FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, lists 17 different examples of inherently governmental, often with parentheticals. And the most recent National Defense Authorization Act has 3 sections addressing inherently governmental, and all are different. So what we need really on this issue is some guidance, frankly, from the President, from the OMB, from policymakers. And what we see in the President's most recent memorandum is that it's not a lot of guidance, frankly. If I had my way, inherently governmental would be scrapped, and we'd stop using it as a term, instead focus more on what are the core competencies of private contractors versus public actors, and how do you find the proper mix between those different competencies. But that's, again, as I said, I think what's happened, if you look at the memorandum, it's very vague on this point. It doesn't really lay out exactly what the Obama administration thinks the agencies, how they should interpret inherently governmental. The second and far more serious problem than that one is the contracting and acquisition workforce, which was referred to a little bit. And this is, to be honest, maybe one of the most unsexy topics to talk about in policy circles, but it's incredibly important because it goes to the heart of the issues that we're dealing with here. In the memorandum that President Obama put out last week, he instructed the OMB director and various agency heads to review existing contracts, identify those that are wasteful and inefficient. He also, he's seeking to open up the procurement process and the practice of so-called sole source contracting. Which all sounds well and good. I mean, from a rhetorical standpoint, it's great. But what goes unanswered is who's going to carry out the President's orders. And what's not included in the President's plan is how he plans on dealing with the crisis in government contracting workforce. At the Pentagon, we've seen over the past several years, the acquisition workforce has dwindled by 25%, while the contracting workload has increased 7-fold. In '97, one auditor was responsible for $642 million in private contracts. Today, it's $2 billion in private contracts. You have the DCMA, which is the Defense Contracting Management Agency, has been decimated. And the recent Gensler report, which is a major report by the Army on contracting, identified this as a serious issue in the Army. And the problem is not going to get, it's going to get worse before it gets better. You've got half of all contract auditors expected to retire within the next 10 years. And so what you need are not just more contract officers, but you actually need make this career path an attractive one. People actually to want to go into the military, for there to be a possibility of promotion if one takes on this task. And so I think it's sort of verboten to call for more government bureaucrats these days. No serious contracting reform effort can succeed if you don't significantly increase acquisition workforce. And I think what the president has done, he's made an important point about some of the challenges that we're seeing. But I fear that without real action on the workforce issue, that the contracting rhetoric may just be talk. If we want to get really serious about this issue, we need to think more seriously about the big picture, institutional changes, and sort of think systemically about how contractors are integrated in the total force. And we need to take seriously the management oversight issues related to contracting. I think until we do that, the problems that Pratap identifies in his book, I think, will only continue going forward.
Thank you, Michael. Now we'll hear from Janine Wedel.
Is that too loud? Now, when reports began surfacing about the extent to which private companies were prosecuting the war in Iraq, that was the first inkling for many Americans of governing beyond government, or what is commonly known as shadow government. Not only that, an army of contractors does the work of the army, as Pratap's book has so eloquently elaborated. But that contractors do much of the work of government, U.S. federal government, much more generally. And so today I'd like to extend our discussion to fill out this wider picture of government by contractor or de facto government, what this means for government in general and America more generally. For the past a few years I've been working on this issue, and I direct here at the New America Foundation a Ford Foundation sponsored project on outsourcing national security. So looking at the outsourcing in several areas. More on that later if you're interested. American political talk about government, both by Republicans and Democrats, and over the years, I argue, has long been obscured by several facades that seem to infuse a political discourse. The first facade is that government is being contained by, for example, caps on the number of civil servants, the number of bureaucrats, and officials. And this overall effort to cap the number of or even reduce the number of civil servants goes back, it's been underway for about 60 years, and it's enjoyed, as I said, bipartisan support. Yet a pillar of government in practice has increasingly been and become shadow government. That array of actors ranging from companies like Halliburton to RAND Corporation, quasi-government organizations, to government advisory boards, to NGOs, and even think tanks that do the government work. These have all proliferated, and they play a greater role than in the past. So shadow government is sort of the elephant in the room that only people in Washington talk about, and defining just who is the government is a more difficult issue than in the United States than in any other developed country. Let me just offer a few numerical benchmarks here. By 2002, an estimated 2/3 of the federal labor force worked indirectly for government. That is, that contractors got, that people got their paychecks. That these were contractors, people got their paychecks from companies, from NGOs, etc. And these people were actually doing the work, the dedicated work of the federal government. So 2/3 of people doing the work, actually federal government work for contractors. Today, as of a few years ago, that figure was 3/4 of the federal labor force worked indirectly for government. Now these are guesstimates. Perhaps an even more reliable barometer of the growth of shadow government is the U.S. federal government. Let me just provide one figure here. The cost of services alone, not counting goods provided by contractors, soared from about $125 billion in 2001, $125 billion, to about $250 billion per year in 2006. In some agencies, for example, NASA and Department of Energy, about 80% of their budgets go to contractors. So what does this mean for our wonderful facade of limited government, of getting rid of big government? Well, I would argue, actually, that the very necessity of maintaining this wonderful facade actually helps create the opposite. The expansion of government, but actually it's shadow government that's being expanded, and it is, as Michael has pointed out, not so very accountable in many instances for many of the reasons that Michael has alluded to. That monitoring, legal and accountability issues are not well worked out. And this takes me to the second facade that we all love, which is that the facade that government remains in charge, it's in control, it's accountable, despite all of this contracting out. And another elephant in the room is that this isn't always the case. And I've spent part of the last few years going through tons of GAO reports and IG reports from various agencies that really study that are reporting on how this is working out in various agencies. While companies like KBR, Halliburton, Blackwater have come to symbolize the perils of contracting out, these firms, whatever their excesses, have largely provided routine services, the dirty and dull work. But gone are the days when government contractors largely did just that dirty and dull work. They have long ago invaded the realm of inherently governmental functions. Those activities which involve the exercise of discretion in the application of government authority. And I agree with Michael that this definition needs to be streamlined and calls for greater uniformity. But I would suggest that we need to keep something like it. The command, this would include, for example, commanding inherently governmental functions, commanding military forces, conducting foreign relations, directing and controlling federal employees, intelligence operations, counterintelligence operations, etc. Contractors long ago crept into all of these areas. Today they manage, for example, who's managing the $700 billion bailout and the things that have come since. They choose and oversee other contractors. They control crucial databases. They draft official documents. They run intelligence operations, and they execute military. They execute military and operating operations and occupying operations. So, what does this mean in practice? And I'd like to just highlight one issue that seems to come up over and over in these reams of reports that I've been blessed with the opportunity of going through. The first casualty of this trend, like war, seems to be of information. The privatization of information. We're in the information age, right? We've got the World Wide Web, wireless internet, 24-hour news cycles, and so on. But it seems that one of the most important dangers in contracting, and especially of government functions, is that crucial information often remains with the contractor, and it's not shared with the government, right? So lurking behind the facade that government is in control is the fact that government sometimes lacks the information it needs to carry out its work, let alone to monitor the entities that work for it. Consider just a couple of things. The title of this GAO report on the Department of Defense. Industrial security. Defense cannot assure its oversight of contractors. This report is about defense's weak ability to monitor some contractors that work with classified information. Or with regard to Homeland Security, GAO warned that the practices of the department encourage, quote, the risk that government decisions may be influenced by rather than independent from contractor judgments. Okay, that's in GAO bureaucraties. But anyway, it highlights the loss of control, government's loss of control over what should be its decision making. So here we see a disturbing role reversal, which is that vital information is often in the hands of the contractor rather than the relevant government officials or agencies. In brief, the implications. Government that literally doesn't know what it's doing can scarcely be minding the store and is vulnerable on many, if not all fronts. So while we were not looking and being seduced by these great facades that are unrelated to, for the most part, to what's actually happening on the realities on the ground, we have government by contractor, de facto government, and this offers more opportunities for private actors, private entities, to make governing and policy decisions without substantial involvement by government or input from citizens. In short, it offers more opportunities for the privatization of policy. And regardless of fresh leadership in the White House, these changes are so systemic and sweeping, they cannot be simply rolled back. Thank you.
Thanks to all the panelists. I had the prerogative of the moderator, a couple brief questions, and then if the panelists have any questions about each of their own presentations, then we'll go to questions. Michael, if the line is going to be drawn in terms of core competencies in use of private security contractors, is there a way to define, for example, what represents a combat role versus a non-combat role? Or is that also sort of too hard to pin down?
Well, no, absolutely, and that's something that already happens. I mean, and Congress certainly has the ability to make these definitions, to identify red lines for certain activities that are not to be outsourced, that are only to be performed by public servants. And one of these issues you're seeing right now on the Hill, Congressman Price, who's been frankly really good at this issue, has a bill, wants to ban the use of private security contractors, private contractors for interrogations. That's one example of a place where you can draw red lines and say this is something that's not going to be outsourced. I personally have, of course, as there always is this complication here, what do you do with linguists? Are linguists private contractors, and how do you don't have enough linguists in the U.S. Army right now? But there are ways to certainly identify red lines, and what I would prefer to see is asking the agencies, including the DoD, to say, to identify what activities should not be outsourced, what activities are a core competency of the U.S. military and cannot be done by private contractors, and make the definitions that way, as opposed to this ambiguous term of inherently governmental that no one understands and is interpreted in many different ways, and frankly is constantly violated by policymakers and by contractors. Another example, just if I can mention it quickly, is contractors overseeing contractors, which you see happen all the time, particularly in the intelligence community. This is an area, again, where Congress can step in and say we want certain capacity to exist in the government, but Congress and the board has not kind of had these kind of conversations. And again, part of the problem is by continuing to use this term inherently governmental, it just pushes the can sort of forward for somebody else to make the decision, as opposed to the president or Congress to really step forward.
Janine, you sort of said the broader phenomenon can't really be rolled back. Is there anything we can do about it in terms of more modest reforms or a longer-term plan?
Well, I think we have to start with where we are now. We have to start with our realistic starting point, rather than and think about what it is that can be done. People ask me all the time, well, can't can't Barack Obama simply reduce the number of contractors? Well, in theory, that can be done. Some can be, government positions can be taken back in some cases. But you also have to look at, we have to think about the pressures that are going to be upon it. Think about the businesses, for example, the contractors, most of their, whose business is largely in government contracts, and their business is not doing so well. So you can imagine what sort of pressure is going to be on the administration to maintain those contracts and even to expand them. That's just one point. Another point has to do with the legislation that Pratap discussed, and the changes in legislation that were implemented during the Clinton years under the Reinventing Government scenario. And again, there's someone in the audience who knows a lot more about this than I do. But the issue is that those changes set in motion a whole set of practices that are to some extent non-transparent, with these mega contracts and so on, and people then competing for little task orders and created a new climate of networking. That's not something that you just roll back by decree. And I say this as a social anthropologist, having watched a lot of these kinds of processes going on. Certain things in life can be done, government can be done by decree. But things like changing these practices, you would have to change the constraints under which these people are operating, and that's not so easily done.
I just want to make one point there. I mean, there's another issue here too, which is you have certain skills that simply the government doesn't have the capacity to perform on their own. And a good example of this is actually Blackwater. There's a reason why the State Department used Blackwater contractors to do personal security for their diplomats, because they did not have the capacity to do it in-house. The diplomatic security couldn't do it. The Pentagon basically told the State Department, we don't want to do this. When they did it in Afghanistan for President Karzai, they actually killed civilians. And that actually was the initial reason why Blackwater was used. And of course, even after Blackwater killed 17 civilians in East Sword Square, their contract was renewed because there was no one even in the private sector who could take on the capacity, take on the responsibility right away. I think you will see them, obviously, when the contract is renewed, they will lose their operations and will go to DynCorp and Triple Canopy. But there are certain skills that frankly have to be outsourced, at least on a temporary basis.
Right, and I would add, well, why is that they have to be outsourced? That's because we've maintained this ruse of limited government, this facade of limited government, and we've outsourced things. So naturally, the expertise and legitimacy and the information is outside the system. It will take some time to bring that back.
We're shortly going to get to questions, of which we'll have about a half an hour. Pratap, I had a sort of a frivolous question and a bigger question. I'm sometimes asked, well, if Halliburton was making such a killing off the KBR, why did they spin it off? The other question is, do you have anything to add to what Michael has said about what the Obama administration should be doing in this area?
Sure, thank you. The reason Halliburton spun off KBR, I think, had partly to do with, a variety of different things. First of all, KBR, Kellogg Brown & Root, which was previously Brown & Root, was a separate company. Both the two companies started separately in the 1920s. Brown & Root was a construction company, Halliburton was purely an oil company. So in separating the two out, they went back to what they originally did. One does construction, KBR, and the other primarily does oil work. And at the time that this happened, was partly 2004, there was so much negative publicity, I think Halliburton decided it didn't want to get stuck with this bad name in some ways, but also more importantly, the oil business was doing very, very well. Your typical log cap contract, military logistics contract, had a return of about 3% in profits. The average oil contract was returning something of the order of 22%. So they separated the two companies so that they would be able to see these different, this is at least the explanation they get. I'm a shareholder actually in both companies, so I go to their shareholder meetings and meet with the CEO and that sort of thing. So their official explanation was separate these two and unlock their potential. I think that was partly true. But I think the most important thing is something that happened about a month ago. KBR was fined for having pleaded guilty to their former CEO, a man by the name of Albert Jack Stanley, confessed to having been involved in a $170 million bribe in Nigeria. So this has been investigated for a number of years. The Pentagon gave them not the Pentagon, sorry, the US government, the Department of Justice fined them $570 million. Now here's the interesting thing. $170 million was supposed to be paid out by Halliburton as the company that owned KBR, and $400 million by KBR, this separate company. These two companies had gotten divorced in 2006, or 2007, really, April of 2007. Now here's the interesting thing. Halliburton paid its $170 million, and out of the $400 million that KBR was supposed to pay out, Halliburton paid $380 million of the $400 million that KBR was supposed to pay. So I have to ask, if these two companies were already divorced, why did Halliburton suddenly decide to pay, this former spouse's alimony, unless they were still sleeping together? And I say that just because, I think you have to look at these companies as operating strategically in order to be able to win contracts and not to be debarred. Now, as it happens, KBR has not been debarred, but in some ways they are very much, working together, and will create consortiums. If you look at any particular company, at one point they'll be in competition, and then suddenly they'll be in working together, and that gets into a whole another realm that I don't really want to get into right now. But to answer the second question, which is what can you do about this, I think there are three things you have to deal with: acquisitions, auditing, and whistleblowing. So, and some of this has been addressed a little bit by the Gansler Commission. So, and the rebidding of the KBR contract. So KBR was originally under a 10-year contract called LogCap 3. It was then rebid. Now, to rebid a contract, if Obama said today, I hate these guys, I want to get them out of here, they paid, all they've been, paying is, Bush and Cheney, and it would take at least a year to rebid a contract of this size. And let's say you could get it done in a year, which would be very unlikely. A contract of this size, as soon as it's awarded to somebody else, there will be a challenge, which will go to the GAO and numerous other places. So you would take at least another 6 months to go through that challenge. So it's a minimum of a year and a half. Typically, it's more like a 4-year process for a contract this size. Michael mentioned the Linguist Contract, which is another very, very big and very problematic contract. That took 4 years to rebid before they could really give it from L3, the primary contractor, the original contractor, to a new company called GLS. And the only way that really happened was because GLS agreed to subcontract, and this is very important, subcontract L3 to hire back most of its workers under this, not even moving them from one contract to another. They were still working for L3, so L3 never lost that contract. So getting rid of a contract is not easy. You need to change the acquisition system. And when they created LogCap 4, the Gansler Commission was created. They created a new contracting command, which has been in place for about a year and a half, I think, less probably, in Fort Lee. And they're supposed to hire 5 new generals, increase the number of contracting officers. So that's a very important part of it. But then you have to completely revamp DCAA, as I mentioned briefly. And finally, you really have to protect the whistleblowers. I've just come from this thing called the National Whistleblowers Assembly with the Government Accountability Project, and they have this very interesting pathfinder where they look at how companies, and this is private companies, catch fraud in the workplace. And on an average, something like 20 or 30% of fraud is caught, by company management systems, which costs a lot of money to put in place. Something like 50%, 40 to 50%, is caught by whistleblowers at no cost to the company. So you have to protect whistleblowers, and not just in the government, but also at the contractor level and the volunteer level, when you talk about people like the Red Cross, to be able to change the system. So if you're going to use contractors, you need to make sure that people at KBR or at the Red Cross or inside the military are protected. And the Bush administration definitely did not do that. The Obama administration, and you can see Michael getting ready to address that, and I'm sure he knows more than I do, but the Obama administration did push forward with the whistleblower amendment, and I'm sure I'm screwing this all up, which I think died. and Gates pushed back at that. So these are three of the very concrete things that need to happen right now. So yeah, so I'll leave it there.
I just want to add that to Pratap's point, that there was some developments last year improving in hiring a number of contracting officers, but it's really a drop in the bucket for what is needed. And I think, and as you said, the contracting command is a good start, but there is so much more work needed on this one. And I think, again, back to the point about maybe before about Obama, one of the disappointments I have, I think, is that it's sort of hard right now to say you want to hire more government auditors and procurement officers. It's a hard sell to make right now, but it couldn't be more important for all the points that we are talking about, but also the ones that Janine's talking about as well.
Now, as promised, we're going to turn to questions, and there's a microphone, which if you would take it, would be great. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you. I'm Laura Kelly with the Progressive Caucus Foundation. I was just going to throw another elephant in the room. Is it Janine?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I've worked in Congress on and off since '94, and I got to tell you, this is not a bipartisan thing about philosophy of government. It's the Republican Party and conservative ideology that has scorned and belittled and frankly destroyed so much of the U.S. government over the last 15 years. From Ronald Reagan onward. And I say this not as somebody who came in with a bone to pick, but actually witnessing what they did to Congress after 1995 in Newt Gingrich. And so, I mean, I know that everybody loves libertarian rhetoric for a platform. I'm from New Mexico. It happens where I'm from. But I think that that's something just to revise. There's a real ideological difference there. The question I have about contracting for y'all is there's a huge effort right now in DC and around the country to rebalance civil military tools of government. And there's a lot of pressure coming down. I work up on Capitol Hill with the Progressive Caucus, which is 80 members of Congress, or 77. We're hoping for 80. And there's a lot of national security reform proposals out there. And it seems to me that the privatization of national security should be just the cornerstone of a lot of these conversations. And I'm wondering, have you followed the national security reform sort of policy agenda and its different manifestations, everything from sort of smart power and post-conflict reconstruction at CSIS to Project on National Security Reform? And do you see hope in there to really wedge this issue in there and get some action on it in Congress? I must say that working with progressives, national security in general is an issue that doesn't come up naturally like domestic issues do, but we're really trying to push this into the congressional agenda going forward.
Do any of you, do you see this as being substantially part of a national security reform agenda?
Well, it's funny, I would just make one comment on this. I mean, I think this issue, I agree with you to a large extent that this is a issue that has been pushed by sort of conservative ideology, if you will, and it was certainly true during the Iraq War. I think there's a flip side a little bit to this, which is that on the Democratic side or the liberal side, I think there is a general antipathy to the idea of government contracting, and I see this a lot as somebody who writes these issues and tries to be sort of even-handed, who gets derided by my liberal friends as a Blackwater apologist, which I'm anything but. But even if I offer the idea that, well, there is a role for contractors to play, and in fact they actually in most cases provide value, I'm usually sort of laughed out of the room or told that I'm in the wrong party. So I think and I'm not to deny your overall point. I think that there has to be a recognition from both sides that this is actually that these types of contracting that we're seeing from the Pentagon is actually not necessarily a bad thing, and that it can provide real value in the end. It just is a question of the mechanisms of that, how contracting actually sort of manifests itself.
I will provide you some figures. I'm not sure I can find them right now, but before the end of our conversation here. If you look at the inception of government contracting, it goes back to the end of in this country, it goes back to the end of World War II. That's when you get the RAND, well, before that you get the RAND Corporation, but I mean, it's when you get the growth of these kinds of initiatives. And that was absolutely bipartisan agenda. Now, it is true that the Reagan administration and Reagan rhetoric, again, this goes to the rhetoric and the facade of limiting big government, that is sort of the rhetorical device around which a lot of this is constructed. But if you look at the numbers for contracting, it's bipartisan all the way. And if you look at the numbers of contractors, that is, and if you look at what was going on in the Clinton administration under the rubric of reinventing government, a lot of these changes that made contract, that turned a system of contracting into mega contracts with a lot of non-transparent processes and things that don't get reported until well after the fact in the federal procurement data system. This was an outgrowth of reinventing government. These were concrete, FARA and FASA were concrete regulatory changes of the Clinton administration. And those have had a profound effect on a lot of what we've been talking about, have made possible a lot of what we've been talking about today. So, I mean, I agree that Republicans have talked the loudest about it, but I think we really need to look at that. We need to look very carefully beyond the facade, and I'll see whether I can find you figures here.
And if I could just push the point a little bit, in terms of trying to rebalance the security policy, in terms of using more than just military tools, relying more on diplomacy, more on other ways to have influence. Do any of you see this notion of privatization impacting that in any way?
So, you repeat that question? I was getting ready to get. Sorry.
Do you think that the issue of privatization will have an impact on efforts to rebalance our foreign policy to put less reliance just on military, use non-military tools as well?
Okay, so just to address the first question, I really do want to agree with Janine that this is very much bipartisan. I have one name for you, and it's Steve Kellman. And that is really, for those of you in the room that know who Steve Kellman was, he's the man who rewrote the rules. He now, I think, teaches at Harvard. You cannot, now, the one hallmark, I would say, of the Republicans is incompetence, lack of planning in going into Iraq, not reinventing the rules. These rules were created under Clinton Gore. Now, they went out and they hired people from their Heritage Institute, intern applicants, send them to Iraq. You probably all read, the book by Rajiv Chandrasekaran, Imperial Life in the Emerald City. So they were incompetent, but they didn't create the rule system. It was very much, and continues to be very much, we need to fix the system, and I think we need to look beyond, did the Democrats and the Republicans do it, into the acquisition system itself. And that is really, and into the auditing system, and into the protection of whistleblowers. These are the issues, and they transcend, the political agendas. I see somebody, I'm going to actually, do you want to ask a question? Do you want to add or disagree with me? This is somebody who actually worked on this.
I decided to disagree with more, you, Pratap, or Michael.
This is somebody actually worked on.
I was alternating.
Feel free to do both.
I was alternating. I'm Richard Loeb. I'm the former deputy administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And Steve Kellman's deputy. Now I teach government contract law at the University of Baltimore Law School, in addition to a full-time job not worth really talking about. But I'm a little concerned about some of the rhetoric I hear between Michael and you, Pratap. I think you may be buying into, as someone observing this for about 30 years, I think you're buying into a bit of what I would call the industry counterattack, which has begun building since the beginning of earlier this decade. I would suggest to Michael that you be careful in your use of the term personnel shortages. I don't know if anybody here knows Jack Gansler, but I'm always interested when the guy who robs the bank, then explains that the bank is bankrupt. It's usually the person who. Be careful in the use of terminology. In fact, I have an op-ed piece which will probably never be published, but distinguish between contracting and acquisition, which I hope to call from now on program management. There is a belief pushed by many with a business agenda suggests that contracting personnel are in short supply and the government needs to hire lots of them. As a matter of fact, we have more people today than we had at the peak of the Reagan defense buildup. What we don't have is program management personnel. And the primary reason we don't have those people is because the programs don't exist any longer, so the people don't exist. But be careful on the shortage of contracting personnel. There may indeed be a shortage, but it's nowhere near as great as industry would like it to sound. And one of the reasons I would suggest industry would like it to sound is if there's a much larger shortage is they'd like to see the money get shoveled out faster. Those are the people who shovel the money out. So if I can make a request, it's to really distinguish between that. You know, facts are important, and I'd be happy to share the actual factual data. So that, you know, we hear numbers, 25% cut, but it's not 25% of the people who sign the contracts. It's 25% of the people who may benefit or oversee the contract. That's a huge distinction between the two in terms of public administration. The second point I guess I would make to Pratap is I strongly disagree with you, and I think on the DCAA situation, I think you need to be aware that there's an industry counterattack on DCAA right now. And one of the arguments being made was the arguments that, in fact, you just made. DCAA is a very frustrated organization for 10 or 15, almost 15 years. They have watched what Janine described, and they have documented it. And now, internally, the whistleblowers within DCAA are being allowed to bring forth. What is being left out of the equation or the story is that DCAA's management, including some of the people you mentioned, have certainly brought this to the attention of the senior-most officials in the national defense establishment. And we're basically told, if you bring this around, you're fired and your agency's over. So I don't think DCAA is a broken agency at all. I think what you're hearing is the frustrations of DCAA auditors, but that goes right up to the top. The people causing the problems aren't the police, if you will, DCAA, the auditors. It's the people they're catching, they're not being allowed to report. And I would argue in many cases, those are in fact the contractors and the contracting personnel. I would just add, my advice to both of you is to be very careful, because I noticed, I see the industry papers float through. It's not important how I get to see them, but I see their talking points, and they've been slightly adopted by many people, including, unfortunately, people I think who mean very well, such as Senator Claire McCaskill, who seems to be doing a great job trying to lead the charge in this area. That isn't a question. I apologize to you. But,
well, you
they can respond.
You deserve, given your experience, the right to make a statement.
So just to, I mean, I think we'll respectfully disagree on the DCA, but I think there's a very important point you raised, which is enforcement. And so people who DCA have pinpointed as being problematic have not actually suffered anything from this. And so that's a real problem. If you say KBR has caused a problem, or L3 or whatever.
Right, they have not suffered because they're under a direct DOD secretarial order that nothing can be done.
Exactly. So that is actually.
But it isn't coming from within DCAF.
It is coming from within DCAF.
It is not coming
from within
There's
DCAF.
a direct secretarial
I know,
order not to do anything.
Well, there you have a problem if you don't have enforcement. I want to, because you brought up national security, I'm not really in the mix of the policy discussions on that, but I want to point out a contract that I've referred to a couple times before, which is the Linguist Contract, the L3 contract. And to go back to this question of how contracts are run is very important. So L3/Titan and now GLS manage 10,000 interpreters in the field in Iraq. So every time an American soldier or general or diplomat wants to talk to an Iraqi, whether they're a prisoner, because they also L3 manage the interrogation system, they go through this contractor, this individual who's been hired, you know, or at least in most cases, these are the people who actually provide the back and forth between Americans who don't speak Arabic and the local population. Now that contract has a very interesting incentive in it. They're supposed to provide, under the original L3 contract, something like 10,000 interpreters. If they supplied less than 10,000 contractors, they were fined. So if they provided, let's say, $100 worth of contractors, they got a $5 profit. If they supplied 90 contractors as opposed to 100 contractors, they were fined for that. And what happened is, in order to be able to fulfill the contract, they pressed anybody they could find into service. People who didn't speak Arabic perfectly, people who didn't speak English perfectly, people who had vendettas. So when we talk about national security, and this is symptomatic, is we have the intelligence side of things, the military and also, you know, other intelligence agencies hiring contractors whose incentive is to make a profit and whose incentive is to hire people who are not qualified because that's what their profits depend upon. So I think that that is actually something that we probably would have to deal with in a completely different panel. But if you're talking about national security, you do need to understand how and examine how intelligence contracting is failing for the very same reasons that a more mundane logistical contract is failing, such as the KBR log cap contract.
I just want to jump off that point. I mean, and this is, just going to use that the interrogation contract as a point here. I mean, to disagree a little with what Janine said earlier, this is not only a function of this of this expanding shadow government. The reality is that we don't have 10,000 contractors in the U.S. military, 10,000 linguists in the U.S. military, and that there is a need to outsource this particular responsibility to the private sector. So I think there are certain situations in which, and this is back to my earlier point, in which it is actually more efficient to use contractors these types of responsibilities than not to. But I want to just pick up on Bill's point. I mean, you talk about the larger issue of contracting the federal government. You look at AID as an example of another agency in which has been decimated as far as its internal capacity, and now has pretty much become a contract writing and grant making agency. They're down to about 2,000 full-time employees, I believe it is now. And I was at a conference recently, and I couldn't believe the stat, but that there are now 7 engineers in all of AID, or maybe it was 12. It was something in that range, but some absurdly low number. I mean, this is a organization that does development, that does big development projects. I think I heard maybe about a dozen economists. So this is a problem that doesn't just restricted to the Pentagon. In fact, in some ways, it's actually worse at AID. In some ways, it's worse in the intelligence community. So this is, as Janine has suggested, this is not a problem that's going away. And what I'm a little concerned in is, and what I'd like to hear more of is people suggesting that instead of giving agencies more responsibility, but thinking about how do you build better capacity within agencies. And I think AID is the perfect example of agency that needs to have a much more developed capacity to do the work it's being tasked to do.
Yes, you've been waiting for a while. The gentleman in the front. It's coming up.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. We have lots to talk about contract. And first, I just want to say a few words, and I would like to bring to the hearing. I think the contract basic problem is all are sole source, and that's the basic problem. In this case, you don't have transparency and you don't have accounting. Okay, I want to bring back to this hearing. What makes you interested in this, and then how do you get clearance to go there? And the second is this. You talk about 200 billion spent on the contract work. 2006 defense spending is 470 billion. And they say spend on Iraq and Afghanistan is 120 billion. And sure, all this thing is national secret. Nobody get the exact number. I just want to know is that you are 200 billion for the contract worker, maybe
20 billion. Sorry, if I said 200, I
I'm sorry.
20 billion in contracts handed out in Camp Arif-Jan. I think that's a rough number.
And I think you have been in Iraq, right? Iraq is very simple. All the urban area and the territory is a lot smaller than Afghanistan. And in Iraq, you can go to urban place. But in Afghanistan, you got to go to village all over the country. And I think that's lots of hard to fight. Yeah. Okay, I just stop here.
Thank you.
I have lots more.
We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, right here. Oh, no, maybe just one more.
All the questions.
I don't know. How many other questions are there? Yeah, I don't think we can do that,
We start
unfortunately.
late.
All right, so
Right, okay,
try to keep
Diane
it
Perlman.
brief. Maybe we'll get one more.
Diane Perlman. I have a question, but I have a hypothesis about the issue that Lorelei raised, which I think is important. I'm a political psychologist, conflict. analysts about whether it's bipartisan or whether the Republicans are driving this, that there's a dynamic between Democrats and Republicans where the Republicans have this like sort of hysterical rhetoric and the Democrats are intimidated. You know, they sort of set the terms of the debate and it drives and accuse them of being soft on defense and all this. So if, to the extent that there could be some bipartisan, it could be that some Democrats are being manipulated by that. So that's a question. I'm not assuming that, but it could account for whatever is bipartisan. But my question is for Janine, what are possibilities for conversion, either from converting the privatization back into government, also for converting maybe military violent aspects to less violent, to the other kinds of conversion to reduce dependence on military and nonviolent strategies of conflict transformation? And is there a way to tie that into the economy and stimulus and reducing government waste or creating more jobs? Sort of three-dimensional conversion.
And you can give your statistics after that too.
Okay. Oh, all right. Yeah. Well, those are great. That's a great comment. I don't think I would say the Democrats are simply being manipulated. I mean, these are conscious choice. And the changes made under Clinton were dramatic, systemic, and system-changing alterations. So, and then of course Bush took them to a new level with the wars coming around, and as Michael pointed out, so we don't have the capacity. So what's going to happen? So how do you do without this cadre of shadow army? You've got to have them at least in some key areas. How do you convert this privatization back to government? I think it goes to the point that I tried to make earlier about the capacity of government agencies and the I think that the pressure there's going to be on. I mean, you can do it, but it's going to take a while because there's been so much migration out of the government of expertise and information and legitimacy. In some cases, as Michael just pointed out, with regard to AID, that's been going on since the 80s, the late 70s. So it's going to be a long process. It's not something that's done overnight, and the pressure to not do that, I think, is going to be considerable. The pressure from contractors, for example, who are an institutionalized part of governing, and they are an institutionalized part of how our whole system of governing works. With regard to the figures, I'm going to give you to Laura, and these aren't perfect, but it's what we have. When you exclude defense jobs, and we can talk about that, after the end of the Cold War, but the ratio of contractor workers to civil servants increased from 3.5 to 1 in 1984, so under Reagan, to 3.9 to 1 in 1996 under Clinton. Okay. With regard to procurement, the proportion of, if you look at what the government is procuring and the ratio of goods to services, the proportion of services as compared with total procurement went from 39% at the end of the Reagan administration, so 1988, to 47% at the beginning of the Clinton presidency, to 60% in 2006. So it's a steady, with some fits and starts. It's a pretty steady increase. That's, one of the reasons we've got to get beyond the rhetoric. Yeah.
Just to address the questions that the gentleman raised about sole source, which are often called no-bid contracts. A lot of contracts today are what are called sole source or no-bid contracts, and of course KBR is very famous for its no-bid contract. There was actually only one contract, the Restore Iraqi Oil, that was purely a no-bid contract, where the military is allowed, in fact, under the rules, under the federal acquisition regulations, to issue a no-bid or sole source contract in times of national security or an emergency. So they have to justify doing it, but they're allowed to do that. And the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction looked at the legal documentation behind the Restore Iraqi Oil project and said at the end of the day, well, it was signed, just to simplify, signed at the right level by the military, so it did not break the law. Was it a no-bid contract? Was it something that we shouldn't agree with? Is it unethical? Those are the questions. But it was actually not illegal under what Sigurd said, looked at the rules and said that that was okay. The other issue that you brought up was transparency. And that is really so critical. I think it goes to the heart of, if I talk about reforming the auditing and the acquisitions and protections for whistleblowing, I left out, I think, a very important part which you brought out, which is transparency. Is we need to have access to the contracts. The public needs to have access to contracts. And that is really, the best way we can ever get that kind of information and look at whether or not a contract has been properly bid, and look at the detail of it and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, we want to take more questions. So,
yeah, the gentleman in the very back, I think he's had his hand up for a while. If you wait for the microphone. Sure. And then, sadly, I think that's probably going to be it.
Thanks. My name's Ben Lando. I'm the editor of the Iraq Oil Report. And actually, my question was about the Restore Iraq Oil contract to KBR. There was very recently, the Sigurd report looked at the major task orders that were part of Restore Iraq Oil, and they found that although the contract came in under budget, it was because they basically got rid of most of the task orders because KBR largely couldn't perform them or weren't performing them well, or spent $140 million, and then they decided to scrap it because it was so far over budget. And I'm wondering how that happens without the government asking for the money back from KBR, without any type of oversight or by the government or whoever's supposed to be auditing this. This report came out with 4 years after the Restore Iraq Oil 1 contract was completed.
Thanks for that question, actually. That's a very important question. I haven't actually read the most recent Sigurd reports, but I think I read the first 100, so I'm sorry if I missed the latest ones, but I think I can guess at what happened because I'm actually quite familiar with that contract. So Restore Iraq Oil, which there were two of them, and the first one was this sort of famous no-bid contract. I'll give a couple of illustrations of exactly what you said. One was the Al-Fatah crossing. And so in this particular case, KBR was asked to restore the pipelines that go from Kirkuk, where the oil was extracted, to Beiji, where the oil was refined. And the pipelines that lead there actually went over a river, the Al-Fatah crossing, and they were bombed by the Americans. So when the Army Corps of Engineers was put in charge of fixing this oil pipeline, and they wanted to get the oil pumping as quickly as possible to prove that they had fixed, the oil system, they decided to run it under the river. And by pure coincidence, I happened to be in Kirkuk at the time, and I completely forgot about this till later. And the Army Corps of Engineers gave me a classified CD. It was an internal CD. It wasn't classified. It was an internal CD. Boasting about the unique system of engineering under which they were going to be able to run these pipelines under the river, something that had never been done before. And that's actually very important to understand. It had never been done before because it wasn't possible. And so this was a riverbed that was fundamentally unstable. And this was supposed to be, I think, a 6-week contract, and 18 months later they failed. And the military fired them and gave the contract to a company called Parsons. And they ended up managing to somehow, they managed to finish the contract. And I don't know if it went way over budget or not, but I think it actually went way over budget. Now here's the problem in that contract, is KBR's geologists said, this is impossible. The military's geologists also said this is impossible. The military high command, on the other hand, said, we don't care, our marching orders, this has to happen regardless. And so they kept marching on, like the 400 that marched into the Valley of Death, without really basically thinking about what was going on. And so they completely failed. Now, KBR is not a company that should not know how to do this. This is a company with more oil expertise than probably any other company except Schlumberger. They really know this business very well. And their geologists said it wasn't possible, but the military didn't want to listen. So here, this is where whistleblowing is so important. When somebody within the first couple of months said, this isn't going to work, why was the military not listening? Why were these things not prioritized? So why did KBR fail in this contract? I think a lot of the responsibility lies with the fact that the military was operating under a set of commands, and it refused to listen to anybody else. And there are other contracts, KBR Rio contracts. You can look at the oil fields in the south and the water and all sorts of other things. But one important thing to understand is why did the Army Corps of Engineers never figure out what was going on here? Well, the Army Corps of Engineers has never actually managed a oil contract before. It really builds dams. It had no expertise in this field at all. So, and to get back to the original, they turned to KBR, which KBR became effectively the acquisitions workforce. Something that I raced through the beginning so quickly. I didn't mention that KBR uses a lot of subcontractors, which have now become billion-dollar companies. And so here you have the Army saying, we don't know what to do, so we're going to ask KBR to figure out what to do, and then give us, a plan. And this was in fact how the Rio contract came about in the first place. The no-bid contract was written by KBR, and when they came to the table, the Army said, well, we don't know what to do in this case. So we're going to ask you to implement this contract, and we're going to get the right general to sign it, and so it'll go forward. So complete incompetence, and complete, refusing to listen to, to whistleblowers, no system of management or transparency, and so utter failure where KBR should not have really failed in this contract. So they just abandoned the stuff and moved on. Most of the oil repair work has not been done, as you mentioned.
On that optimistic note, we're going to call today's proceedings to a halt, but I feel confident we're going to revisit this issue in various forms. So I hope we can continue the conversation. My apologies to folks whose questions we didn't get to, and thanks everybody for coming.